In 1823, few European countries took the Monroe Doctrine seriously. By the 1890s, the US now is becoming a significant power. Now, when the US spoke, now people paid attention. A tide was beginning to turn in what the Monroe Doctrine signified and the actual character of the Monroe Doctrine, which up to the end, till 1898, had been a defensive doctrine that sought to keep out others from entering the Western Hemisphere. Theodore Roosevelt was citing the Monroe Doctrine as a reason to force Spain to leave Cuba. But the immediate cause of the Spanish-American War was the destruction of the battleship Maine. And that was what prompted the United States to declare war. After the war, the US emerges as a global power. In 1902, the Venezuelan government defaulted on loans that they had secured from European countries. And countries actually sent their fleets to block Venezuelan ports in an attempt to force the government to pay the debts that they owed. And when Roosevelt saw that happening, he said, now wait a minute, we will collect it for you. Take your battleships home. We'll take care of situations where nations who are in flagrant violation of the established rules of civility will be taken to task by the United States in this hemisphere. And that was the beginning of the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. They realized, President Roosevelt and his advisors, that problems would not go away magically. You could not just go in, fix the customs systems, and get out. In the Dominican Republic, they did that in 1905, but they had to come back in 1916. And the second time, they stayed for 8 years. And it was an occupation for 8 years. In Haiti, they stayed for 19 years, 1915 to 1934. And in Nicaragua, they had to come in 3 times. So in order to, so to speak, fix the problems, it took sustained effort. And that's how you got to these occupations. The US was viewed through a different prism after the interventions began in 1905 under the Roosevelt Corollary. Of course, in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt says, we will not intervene in the affairs of our neighbors, and that was the end of the Corollary. But in 1945, when the Cold War starts, then the Monroe Doctrine becomes a good jacket to wear to keep the Soviets out of the hemisphere. Of course, Guatemala in 1954 was a US unilateral action, and it was certainly mentioned in the case of Cuba, in Dominican Republic, 1965. I know there are scholars who say that it allowed the US to become a nation in the world arena, to be able to execute its power, etc. But I think in Latin America, the view is largely negative about the Roosevelt Corollary. I recall when I was ambassador to Nicaragua, after Hurricane Mitch, which was the worst disaster in Central American history, we offered to bring in US troops to rebuild some of these roads and schoolhouses, etc. And the Sandinistas, who were not pro-American by any means, mounted a campaign saying, well, you saw what happened when the Marines came last time, so the US wants to recapture its territory, and not only that, they're going to bring AIDS into the country. This was the time of the AIDS epidemic and its aftermath. So we had to mount a public relations campaign against that, which was difficult, but I think at the end, we convinced the Nicaraguan population that we were not there to take over territory, but just to help. And we did that by letting the Nicaraguan press interviewed our soldiers and Marines when they came in, and they saw that they were, people just like them. We had women, we had a very diverse army, and they all said the right things. We're here to help and to go back. But you see, that's the kind of campaigns that can be mounted by recalling what happened during the Roosevelt Corollary and these U.S. interventions.